Hello, everybody. Pawn endgames are a very important fundamental area of endgames as a whole. The endgame is one of the most important, if not the most important, area in chess itself. For example, that if you wish to understand chess as a whole, you should study the endgame first, because, for example, if you wish to understand the middle game, you really want to understand the endgames that can come out of it. And if you don't understand those, you can't understand the middle game. Consequently, same thing, if you can't understand the middle games, then you can't understand the openings that they come from. So this lecture, first in the series, is a very basic one. It will cover the first few fundamentals of pawn endgames, such as the square of the pawn, the opposition, and key squares. This is largely meant for people who are very inexperienced with the endgame, but have a fair knowledge of chess as a whole. So the first technique we'll cover is the square of the pawn. This constitutes of a race between the pawn and the opposing king. Basically, in endgames, since material is very limited, especially in pawn endgames, the objective is not immediate checkmate so much as to get a queen and to checkmate with that. Now, this is assuming that you know how to checkmate with a queen, and if you don't know that, you need to learn that in order to win these pawn endgames. So, the objective here for white is to promote that queen, and the objective for black is to stop that promotion. As we can see here by playing the moves, black's king does manage to stop the pawn. But however, there is a very simple technique. It's very fast and very easy to learn that allows you to quickly evaluate any of these positions, no matter where the pawn and king are. It's called the square of the pawn, and it's called so because you make a square by first draw an imaginary line from the pawn to the promotion square. Then you basically make a square around the pawn, going sideways, like this. If the king is inside this square, with the pawn moving, then it will catch the pawn. If not, if it's outside the square on, say, h5 or g2, then it will not catch the pawn. And since the king is on f3, it will catch the pawn, as we saw. And if it's outside, then it will not catch the pawn. This works no matter where the pawn is. If, say, the pawn is on c5, then you draw the same square, and it also goes in both directions. And there is one minor exception. If the pawn is on the second rank, say a2, then at first glance it would seem that in this position the black king is actually inside this square. We draw it. However, as we all know, pawns on the second rank can move two squares at once, which shrinks this square by 2, and the black king can't do the same thing, so it's outside of the square, and the pawn promotes. Now, with this technique, you can quickly evaluate any of these positions. And for an example of how this is practical in more complex positions, let's take a basic queen endgame. So here it's black to move. And now, as black's move, black wants to figure out whether he should retreat his king and fight out this queen endgame, white's out extra pawn, or if he should trade queens by going to e5. And now, if you don't understand the pawn endgame here, then you can't really judge whether you should trade queens or not. This is an example of where the understanding of fundamentals is extremely important in understanding the more complicated ideas. But, as we now know, with this check taking, you now can draw the square of the pawn. And as we can see, the king is not inside this square. Therefore, it will not catch the pawn. And the pawn will promote, as you can easily verify. And this is just lost. And since we know that, we can now judge from our original position that black should simply move his king. And in fact, this endgame is drawn. Now, since you can understand this position, it allows you to understand more complicated ones, and consequently, the chain continues. So that's a basic overview on the square of the pawn. And now, However, things are more complicated when you consider the opposing king as well. In our first example, with the king on f3 and the pawn on a3 in the race, the white king was on h1, or was completely uninvolved in the race. Now, if the white king plays an active role, it can quickly change the evaluation of such positions. If, say, for example, the white king was on c6 instead of h1, then we find the black king is still in the square hasn't changed, but black's king can't get to the pawn. It's far behind, and again, it promotes because the white king shelters the pawn and blocks off black's king. Things get more complicated when you have this sort of position. And in fact, there are a few basic rules and formula that you need to know in order to evaluate these positions. So I'll explain the basic formula and then show you how you can utilize them to win the won positions and draw the drawn ones. So if we have a pawn on, say, d2, here's the basic rule. If you have a pawn on the first half of the board, in white's case, ranks 1 to 4, the key squares are the ones 2 rows in front of the pawn. The ones one to the side and the middle one. If the white king can get to these squares, then you're winning. If it can't, and the black king can block it from, say, d5, then it's drawn. In order to understand this, which is a very important part of pawn endgames, what we want to understand is something called the opposition. The opposition is basically the right to oppose the enemy king. So if we have our kings opposing each other from d3 to d5, if white goes to e3, being at his move, then black can oppose the white king with king e5. If white keeps moving, black can still oppose it. And since black can do this, we say that black has the opposition. If it was black's move here, then black would have to move out of the way, and white would have the opposition. And in general, it's in these pawn endgames, in these king and pawn against king, it is always in your interest to have this opposition. Since, let's say, for example, our king's on d3, the black king's on d5, if white has the opposition, that is, if black's king has to move out of the way, and white can oppose it, there's another technique we can use called, this one is known as outflanking. Now, so it's black's move. Black moves to the side. Since white wants to get to any one of these 3 squares, white can actually outflank, that is, move to the opposite side of black, and simply take this square, and white's winning. However, if it's white's move, then black can simply get in front of white's king no matter where it goes. And this is the basic rule. Now, however, if the pawn is more than halfway up the board, that is, it's on the 5th rank or farther, then you can actually win even if your king is only 1 row in front. So the basic rule, the pawn's on the first half of the board, you need to be 2 rows ahead. Second half of the board, you need to be 1. So to demonstrate this, let's show the winning technique from here. Now, if black's king is in front of white's, we'll say it's white's move, so black has the opposition. What white does, moves the king over, black gets in front. And at first it seemed like white can't do anything, and in fact he can't by moving his king. But what white does, is when you've got this position and it's white's move, you simply play e6. King has to move e7. And now we find that black's king has to get out of the way, at which point white can advance his king, and the pawn promotes next move. And in addition, if from this position it's black's move, it's actually even simpler. When black's king moves, use the outflanking we mentioned earlier, move to the side. And now, since the king covers all these squares, white's next 3 moves, regardless of what black's does, will be e6, e7, and queening. So in short, this is your basic sort of goal position for the end. Regardless of whose move it is, we've shown that white is winning. So if you can get to this, you have a won game. So if we get from, let's say we get from here. Now, as I mentioned, these are the key squares. Now white's winning here, so let me show you how. So first off, if it's white's move, since black has the opposition, simply moving back and forth will still get you nothing. What you want to do actually is make black move and give yourself the opposition by playing d3. You do want to be very careful about this though, because if this is white's move, then all of a sudden you've got your drawn position. So you want to make sure that the black has the opposition when you do this, because then it's yours. So when black moves to the side, you move up. Again, you're in the key squares. And note that at any point, if black decides to go up like this, you can simply move the pawn and move the king up, and you've still advanced. Usually black will try to defend by moving the king back again, at which point you'll just go in front. You've got the opposition, so you don't want to play d4 because then you'll give black the opposition. So you just play king e6. He goes up, then you can advance the pawn. If he goes here, then you just play king d6. Now in a couple of moves, we got our goal position. The pawn, king, and then the king up here. And since it's black's move, we use the outflanking technique, and we've got our promotion. This is the basic winning technique for all of these endgames. Of course, you'll always have some cases where you're on the worst side, so it's just as important to know the drawing technique in these positions. Let's say we're here. The king's on c3 and c5. If it's black's move, we have our win. King moves, king here, and white will manage to outflank next move. But if it is white's move, then white cannot do this, and in fact this position is drawn because since black has the opposition, he will never reach these squares. So in fact, no matter how hard white tries, he'll never get anything achieved this way. So one attempt he may make is to move the pawn. Now the basic guide for black, two simple rules. You stay in front of the pawn when you can, the two squares here. And if white decides to dance around, you just do the same thing. But when white's king advances next to the pawn, this covers d5, so you can't go there. Just move in front of it. So basically, oppose the pawn when it moves up. Then when white's king comes up as well, you oppose that. So again, oppose it. Stay in front of the pawn. By using this technique, eventually you'll get pushed to the back rank. It's forced. There's no way to avoid it, but you're still drawing. And now in this position, it's very important that you still move straight back. So here, let me show you the basic draw first. King d8. You oppose him. And if white decides to advance again, he finds that he actually has to stalemate you because you've got nowhere back to go, and all the squares are covered, and this is just a draw. And there's nothing else white can do because any other move hangs the pawn. And we've seen that dancing around by just going to random squares, you just stay in front of the pawn, and white has nothing you can do. It's just drawn. However, you do remember I did mention you have to be very careful to go to d8, and this is why. If you should say, unfortunately, go to e8, and white's king simply goes up here. If you move, you have to move, or white would have to play stalemate, but unfortunately it's black's move, and we don't have the stalemate. Black is forced to move out, white moves his king up, and this is the end. So those are the two fundamental winning and drawing techniques, with the king and pawn against king. If you remember those, you should be able to figure out any position by knowing that you want to get the opposition like that, and that you want to get into one of these key squares if you have the pawn. Now there is one major exception to this rule, the rook pawn, which is basically a pawn on the rook file, the A file or the H file. Now the reason this is different is because although we mentioned the outflanking because of the opposition, say that here it's black's move because now white has the opposition, he can oppose. Normally, when black moved his king to the side, we would do an outflanking by moving our king to the other side. Unfortunately, here, there is no outflanking. There's no file to the left of the A file, and therefore no outflanking to be done by king. So, this is actually a draw as long as black can get his king to the corner. It doesn't matter how far ahead you get, because no matter whose move it is, no matter how the position is, a7 will always be stalemate because black doesn't have an extra square to go to. As he did when the king was on d8, it could go to c7. So the rook pawn tends to be far more drawish than the other pawns, and it's very important to remember this so you don't get an unpleasant surprise in one of your games.